Hello, my name is Camilla Elliott. I'm a professor in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. I've created this workshop and a companion workshop to help you to write high-level advanced essays on the poem She Walks in Beauty by George Gordon Lord Byron, a poem that was written in 1814. The other day I was speaking to a GCSE examiner who told me, surprisingly, that students get no points, 0 points, for simply listing formal poetic devices in a poem or simply describing author biography or any other kind of cultural context. What you have to do to earn points is to integrate these things into your interpretation of the poem to create a unified argument and an integrated essay. So that's what we're going to do in this workshop. Let's start by reading the poem. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. Now, it is a beautiful poem, and it is a very musical poem, and that's going to feature very heavily in our analysis in this workshop. But it's also a poem that when we come to think of the topic and the theme of love, which is often the label that this poem gets put under in a list of texts that have been assigned for an exam, it's quite alien from our ideas of love today. And this picture on the right, which was an illustration that went with a poem in the 19th century, reflects that as well. It's very ethereal, it's very religious, it's very sentimental, it feels quite stylized and artificial. And it can make this poem quite alienating to us to study if we think we've got to figure out how it relates to love and whether we've had any personal experiences of love that feel like this. So I'm hoping by the end of this workshop, where we're going to create an analysis of the poem based in Byron's biography, that you will find this poem is a lot more interesting, and even that there are things that you can relate to in this poem once we've done this analysis. So we're going to do a biographical reading of the poem that integrates meaning of the words with the form of the poem and also the context, which is going to be author biography. I'm going to give you a headline here of what our argument is going to be. And that is that this poem is about how Byron found women to be a soothing influence on his troubled mind and his tempestuous life. We're going to read letters that he wrote and journal entries, and we're going to meet the woman who inspired the poem. And then we're also going to look at how the music of the poem and the sounds and the imagery contribute to this argument about the woman's soothing influence on Byron. So let's begin with a letter that Byron wrote to Annabella Milbank, whom he would later marry. And this was written months before he met the woman who inspired the poem. And he's trying to explain to her what drives him to gambling, to fighting, to traveling so much, to womanizing, to drinking, and all kinds of exploits. And he says that he does it because he needs to feel the sensation and the agitation that these activities bring to him. Otherwise, he feels like he doesn't exist, and that there is a kind of void in him that creates a craving for these things. Let's read this passage. The great object of life is sensation, to feel that we exist, even though in pain. It is this craving void which drives us to gaming, to battle, to travel, to intemperate but keenly felt pursuits of every description, whose principal attraction is the agitation inseparable from their accomplishment. So quite apart from gambling to win money, fighting to win, traveling to reach a destination, womanizing to have a conquest, drinking to feel good, what he's driven to and by is to discover the emotions in these things and to have a sense of feeling that makes him feel alive. Many of you may already know about Byron's scandalous, troubled, and also highly celebrated life. Not only was he a famous poet, but he was also famous in what were his century's equivalents of our tabloids, newspapers and magazines. You'll see on this slide some of his exploits. So at university, he kept a pet bear and walked it around on a lead like a dog. He had numerous lovers, male and female, and he wrote about some of his experiences with these lovers in his long narrative poems, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and Don Juan. As a result of these affairs, he fathered illegitimate children. He often abandoned them and left them in convents. He had a highly public affair with Lady Caroline Lamb, who was as dramatic as he was. She made a big public furor about their affair, and he broke it off with her because he liked things to be kept a bit quiet. And when he broke it off with her, she threatened to stab herself. Then she wrote an expose about her experiences with him, where she famously called him mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He married the very moral and upright Annabella Milbank, but that marriage didn't survive. There was a high-profile and scandalous divorce in which she accused him of all sorts of terrible behaviors, and he didn't deny them. And then he was rumored to have had an incestuous affair with his married half-sister Augusta Lee and to have fathered one of her children. There's quite a bit of evidence for this, but it's not been definitively proven. Byron wrote in his journal, just a few months before he wrote this poem, his experiences with women generally. Let's read this. There is something to me very softening in the presence of a woman, some strange influence, even if one is not in love with them, which I cannot account for, having no very high opinion of the sex. But yet I always feel in better humor with myself and everything else if there is a woman within ken. So Byron, as we've seen, sought out drama, sensation, agony, pain, turmoil, and lived on the edge of society morally and socially. And he also experienced great suffering and depression, as well as his wildness and his marvelous charm. And women had a soothing effect on him. Now, what's also striking in this passage is that he didn't actually think very highly of women. Yes, he pursued them, and yes, he chased them. And what's puzzling to him, and why he's writing this entry, is he doesn't understand how they can have such power over him, because he doesn't respect women very much. So here is the woman who inspired the poem. The year was 1814. Byron was 26, and so was his first cousin's wife, Anne Wilmot Horton. He met her for the first time at a party, and their meeting inspired the writing of She Walks in Beauty. She had a powerful effect on him, not only because she was a beautiful woman, but also because she was dressed in a dazzling black dress covered in silver spangles. You can see where he got the idea of the cloudless night and starry skies. It's interesting that he took something as literal as this dress and catapulted it up into the heavens. The picture on the left is obviously not from this period. It's actually from a 1963 Paris fashion show. But I've included it beside a portrait of a gazing Byron to suggest that meeting and the effect that she had on him as a man and as a poet. He woke up the next morning and wrote She Walks in Beauty. So we have the biographical context and we have the basic argument. What we need to do now is to integrate this biographical reading with some comments about poetic form so that the essay weaves them into the argument rather than just listing them separately. Now it's over to you. What I want you to do is to look at this poem and do two things. First of all, I want you to underline or write down the words in the poem that present the woman as a softening influence on the speaker or poet. Secondly, I want you to look again at how her softening influence is expressed in the sounds of the poem. Remember, words are not just things that we look up in the dictionary to see what they mean. They also have sounds. They have an aural and musical presence. And that's what I want you to look for. It may be that a word both means soft and sounds soft, like the word soft itself. But there are other things there besides that direct connection. So pause the video now and do this task. And when you're ready, press play and continue on. I've highlighted some of the words that to me suggest the woman's softening influence on the poet. There are probably many more words that you could identify, and I hope that you did. So it starts with beauty. Beauty is itself a softening influence on many people. Beautiful day in nature, a beautiful piece of art is softening. Walking too is a movement of the body that is fluid and slow. It's not running, it's not galloping, it's not stasis. So there is something soothing even in that image. The word cloudless suggests clarity and freedom from obstructions and cares and burdens. Starry is something that also suggests things like starry-eyed, a kind of hypnotic, glazed over effect here, as well as a kind of literally twinkling, sparkling, soothing image. In the next few lines, the woman takes the extremes of dark and bright with which Byron himself grapples, and she manages, rather than swinging wildly from one extreme to the other, to mellow them into a composite tender light. Byron is unable to do this, and perhaps Heaven to Gaudy Day we'll look at on the next slide. Gaudy Day seems to symbolize the poet. So grace and waves, these are also gentle qualities of the character and the attitude and the demeanor, and a gentle movement. Softly lightens, goes back to that mellow tender light. Serenely sweet goes again up to the heavens, and yet it has a kind of tenderness and also dear. There's something about dear, that kind of feeling if somebody's dear to you. They're not passionately attractive to you, they're not fighting with you, and it's a contrast to Byron's kind of relations with people. So we have in the last stanza, soft, calm, she smiles, doesn't grin, doesn't grimace, and the colors of her body and her hair and her face glow rather than burn. And we have also an indication of her character as something that is at peace with everything on earth. And by contrast to Byron's passionate, guilty, illicit, tempestuous, sometimes even violent affairs, her love has the innocence of a child. I mentioned that I think Byron can be read as gaudy day, not only because he's the one that the heaven denies the ability to balance out extremes and to temper or mellow himself, but also because of some of the cultural conventions that were going on at the period. Everyone who was educated would have read the Greek and Roman classics, and the gods of the sun there were male, the gods of the moon were female. But the woman in this poem isn't even as bright as the moon. She is softer than that, twinkling stars against a black background. We also have Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was Byron's one of his best friends. And he wrote of Byron how beautiful his face was, so beautiful a countenance I scarcely ever saw, and described his eyes as the open portals of the sun, things of light and for light. So let's now look at the sounds of the poem. And again, you may have come up with things that I don't discuss, and that's great, and you should definitely do your own readings as well. So the first thing I want to note about the poem is that it has the rhythm of iambic tetrameter. This is an incantational, hypnotical, magical sound, magical rhythm. It's the same rhythm used by the witches in Macbeth. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. It's a kind of hypnotic, incantational rhythm that creates a soothing effect. Let's read a few lines here. She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Now Byron cleverly keeps it from being da 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 da, which would be mechanical. So in that meet, there's a pause there, and then it just rolls in her aspect and her eyes. So it's not just iambic tetrameter, but it's also the brilliant way that he uses it. So instead of just saying this poem is written in iambic tetrameter, you can say that it has a soothing hypnotic effect, and that will tie it to your argument. The next thing to look at in those lines and throughout the poem are these long vowels, which open the words out into expansive sound spaces in much the way we're opened up into the night, the climes, the starry skies. The fact that they keep shifting from different vowels to different vowels stretches the mouth and the sounds in different directions. Cloudless climes and starry skies, and so on, all the way through the poem. There's also lots of alliteration in this poem, and that is where two adjacent words start with the same letter. So we have in the first line cloudless climes and starry skies. We have in the second stanza which waves. We have serenely sweet, and so on. What alliteration does is it creates sound bridges that help to smooth out and create fluidity in the poem, creates a sense of echoes that also open up the sound. There's also symmetry and balance going on in the poem. The poem is about, in terms of its meaning, how the woman balances out extremes like dark and bright, and heaven and below, and love and innocence, extremes that Byron can't navigate. So we end up with a mellow, tender light that combines the dark and the bright, by contrast to this wild Byron swinging from darkness and depression to gaudy, exuberant living. He yearns for her balance himself, and he makes that happen in some other ways. There's something called a caesura, which is where you break a line in the middle with a mark of punctuation or perhaps just with a pause. So the first line of the second stanza, he's talking about that perfect balance. And he says, one shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace of her ability to mellow this darkness and light and get them together. So I think of that caesura as like the balance on a pair of scales with the two sides balancing out on that punctuation mark. He does that in the first line of the third stanza. But beyond that, he uses punctuation to also pace, temper, and slow down the poem. So in the last stanza, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent. This is kind of a sense of pausing and letting almost like the poem swing into a bit of silence with those marks of punctuation, and then begin again with more sound. This allows the poem to breathe, and it keeps it from galloping off along its iambic tetrameter, and so on. Then there are soothing sibilants. These are S sounds, as in serenely, sweet, express, and many other places. These sounds sort of soothe and shush and make the poem almost like a lullaby, putting you into a trance or into sleep. One of the interesting things about this poem is that Byron had it set to music, and he often requested that it be performed for him to soothe him. And what we can say is that it isn't just the woman that soothes Byron, it's the poem itself. It's the poem that he wrote about the woman. And for many readers, it has had a soothing effect on readers as well. Quite apart from the music that it's been set to, it has its own musicality. We also have soothing imagery in the poem. Not only are our ears flowing and moving with the sounds of the poem, but our inner mental eyes are moving in response to the images, the painting that Byron creates. So we start with, she walks in beauty, and I see a woman walking, and then all of a sudden, like the night, so my eyes go up to the sky where I'm looking at cloudless climes and starry skies, and then I'm seeing dark and I'm seeing bright extremes, and then he's telling me, no, they mix and meld, they're mellowed to a tender light. And then I'm taken through to see the light going along her black hair, which waves in every raven tress. There the sound and the images come together. And he's throwing splashing light on her face. And he's suddenly flashing a smile from that face and giving us glowing tints and so on. So the images and the sounds of the poem work together to create this soothing, but also quite dynamic and fluid picture and sound that is the poem. Well, I hope that this presentation has helped you to see some things about this poem that can make it more interesting to you. And you can relate them to issues in your own life and society today. You can think about emotional extremes and what it is that soothes you. You can think about celebrities and how they fascinate people, even as people judge and condemn their behaviors. You can think about celebrities today, whether politicians or musicians or actors, who have enormous followings, even though they may be widely condemned by the more moral and conventional branches of society. And I hope that you've learned something about Byron's life, that you've learned something about poetry as music and as painting that will help you to enjoy poems even when the ideas in them and their representations of things like love don't really relate to your own. This slide here offers some other resources for you. You can learn more about Byron's life. You can listen to some more recent musical settings. We don't have the one that Byron listened to, but here are some others. This slide tells you where the images in this workshop came from. Here are some other videos that are in this playlist or will be coming soon. Thank you for listening, and I wish you well with your thinking and writing about poetry. If you would like to hear more about studying English literature or creative writing or both at university, have a look at our website,